Hi, today I have selected for you 8 true scary Reddit stories on the topic. What is the scariest true story you know? Listen to the end. After all, who knows where I hid the most terrible story? Don't forget to like and subscribe. This will help my channel a lot. Thanks. Turn on the subtitles and let's go. Story 1. I grew up in a funeral home. I helped out in the office. When I was about 15, we got a call from a man whose wife and infant baby had been murdered in cold blood. There were very few clues. It made headlines. Cops set up surveillance at the viewing. It was heartbreaking, as the mother was holding the baby in her arms. I was asked to take the flower cards and periodically get the husband and ask if he recognized the names. I then photocopied them and put them back. I did it because I was a kid, people knew me, and I was unobtrusive. I talked to the husband quite a bit. He seemed devastated and shaken. The cops told me they had an eyewitness to someone leaving the house the day of the murder. The witness was a 3-year-old girl. She recognized the man leaving. It was the husband's best friend. Turns out that the friend and the husband had made a pact to kill each other's families and run off with their secretaries. The little girl identified the friend, and I guess one of them cracked. They both went to jail on multiple counts, all on the testimony of a 3-year-old. I still cannot believe to this day that man stood right beside me multiple times and I had no clue. I don't think I ever looked at life the same way after that. Story 2. He was a shoemaker who lived in Morocco in the late 19th and early 20th century. He and his accomplice, a 70-year-old woman called Anna, used to drug and kill young women who came to the shop. Eventually, one of the victim's parents traced her movements to the shop, and after the remains of 36 mutilated corpses were discovered nearby, Miss Fewey and Anna were questioned and tortured. Anna didn't survive, but Miss Fewey confessed to murdering them, usually for a tiny amount of money. His initial sentence was crucifixion, a very unusual punishment even then. However, there were many protests from powerful foreign embassies, and Morocco couldn't do much against them. Instead, he was sentenced to beheading, a more common punishment. However, the mood in Marrakech was that this was far too lenient, so they settled on immurement, being walled up alive. A special cell was constructed in the wall of the bazaar, about 2x 6 feet. Chains were attached to one wall to ensure he would be kept standing. Miss Fewey wasn't told of his fate until the morning of his execution, when he was led, screaming, in chains and slowly bricked up inside. Once the last course had been laid, the crowd would fall silent until he started screaming, when they would cheer. He screamed nearly constantly for 2 days. On the 3rd day he fell silent. Story 3. The New London School Explosion. A school in Texas in 1937 tried to tap into natural gas on their own, and it ended up leaking and blowing up the school. It's the reason they make natural gas scented in Texas, and probably the US now. I'm amazed I never heard of this in school, because it seems like something that should be taught. I read some survivor stories and I had fucking nightmares. It was horrible. 3 in particular stuck with me. One was a 7 or 8-year-old girl. She saw her best friend and playmate with her entire body crushed by concrete with only her shoulders and head above it, and she still had a lollipop in her mouth like she didn't know what happened. Another was a guy, I think a 16 to 17-year-old, helping undig people and bring them out of the wreckage. He saw a dad holding his daughter crying his eyes out while the back of the girl's head was broken open with her brain on the ground next to her. The last was a 9-ish-year-old girl who went to find her mom after it happened. There was a PTA meeting going on at the time, so there was a lot of parents at the scene. Her mom was freaking out trying to find her, but didn't even recognize her. She went up to her mom and called out to her, but she just kept saying, "You're not my daughter." She was so covered in blood and ash and tears that her own mother couldn't recognize her. Story 4. One of my best friends growing up had an aunt that was the sweetest, most generous woman you could possibly know. She started dating a man that fell in love with her because of how sweet and kind she was. After a month or so of being together, he accused her of being too nice to other people, so he bludgeoned her until she was unconscious and cut her heart out of her chest while she was still alive. He thought that it was the worst example of sheer disrespect, that she would exhibit kindness towards other people when she was in a committed relationship. He believed he owned all of the good she had to give, and by being nice to people that weren't him, she may as well have been cheating with the whole town. He killed her for being the person he knew her to be when they started dating. The fact people like him exist is terrifying to me. Story 5. When I was 7, I was raking rocks in my aunt's front yard, and a beat-up pickup truck pulled up. The man got out, fiddled with something under the hood, and then closed it. He asked me, "Hey kid, do you know how to pop a clutch?" Spending my childhood on a farm, I did indeed know how. Yes, I responded, give me a hand real quick, he said. So I started walking towards his truck. At the last second my mom called out to me from the garage, and I turned around to see what she wanted. I heard the door slam, the truck start, and he drove away. That memory never really came up until one day, about 30 years later. I jump up after laying down to go to bed when out of nowhere it came back and it hit me. This guy was trying to kidnap me. What the fuck? What bullet did I dodge? I mean, you ever have a memory come back and you get scared? I mean, scared over the memory? I was shaking for at least a half hour over it. It still freaks me out thinking about it. Story 6. A woman I worked with a few years ago told me how her life had changed drastically. She went from having a decent job to becoming an alcoholic and working as a cleaner. She had planned to move to Spain with her husband and young daughter and had a great job lined up out there. The plan was her husband and daughter would fly over first and she would fly over a week or two later due to finishing her old job a little later than planned. Her husband rang her on the day he arrived and said the house was lovely and the furniture had arrived by ferry act. That was the last time she ever heard from him. Her husband and daughter was found dead by authorities a few days after she rang, explaining she was concerned for their welfare as she had had no contact with them and she was extremely worried. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. It is so scary to think how fast your life can change. Story 7. I read a story recently about Paulette Gerbera, a 4-year-old child who went missing from her room in 2010. Her parents immediately notified authorities and started a social media campaign to find Paulette. Paulette's room was searched multiple times and used by her parents to do media interviews. Here's the terrifying part. Paulette was found dead 10 days later in her bed. She had wedged herself between the mattress and the footboard and suffocated. Here is her bed before they found her. It's insane looking at that picture and knowing she is there and no one had found her. Story 8. The Franklin Expedition. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 British sailors and military personnel on 2 ships embarked on a mission to find the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic across to the Pacific through Arctic waters. The ships, named HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, 2 former warships reclassified as icebreakers thanks to their sturdier builds, departed British waters in the 1845 and were never seen again. In subsequent rescue attempts and investigations, it was discovered that quite possibly everything that could have gone wrong on the expedition did so. The weight of the ships with their reinforced hulls and decks designed to fire mortars and cannons off of worked against them as much of the waters crossed were shallow and filled with rocks and icebergs. The time chosen to launch the expedition occurred at one of the coldest Arctic periods in recent history, meaning the polar ice and, particularly the pack ice, didn't melt like usual as the ships became locked in the frozen water and essentially experienced an endless winter for over 4 years. The food they stored, which was supposed to last for years thanks to the revolutionary new process of canning, was bought at the lowest bidder. Much of the food was improperly sealed and spoiled, leading to food poisoning, and even the ones that were properly sealed and kept intact were riddled with lead thanks to the soldering used to keep the food inside fresh. In conjunction with the lead pipes in the ships the men would have been drinking out of for years meant the entire crews of both ships was slowly being infected with all manner of diseases, namely botulism, scurvy and heavy lead poisoning, which also affects the mind, leading to memory loss, heavy paranoia and general mental deterioration, combined with already present tuberculosis that killed a small number of the crew before departing to the Arctic. After about 2 to 3 years stuck in the ice, the captain in charge of the voyage, John Franklin, and many other crew members died in unknown circumstances, and the remainder decided to abandon ships and try and hike out together to the nearest trading outpost in Backfish River in Canada, hundreds of miles away, by loading up their rowboats with supplies and fixing them on sleds to be pulled. All remaining crew perished on that journey. Their remains discovered by local Inuits Netsiluk tribes, who describe desolate campsites of skeleton-like corpses with hazily built, half-open tents, and even human body parts in cook pots, heavily implying that the men resorted to cannibalism in their last desperate hours. Thank you for watching. Which story did you like best? Give feedback in the comments. Subscribe to not miss new stories.